Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership podcast. My name is Charles Good, the president of the Institute for Management Studies, and your host today. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and strategies that you can apply from discussing the research of esteemed leadership experts and practitioners to take your leadership to the next level. My goal is that what we've discussed today will be immediately actionable and useful to you. And I'd love to hear your comments for this episode about what you're planning on implementing. Today's guest is Dr. Michael Roberto, the Trustee Professor of Management at Bryant University. He joined the tenure faculty at Bryant after serving 6 years on the faculty of Harvard Business School. His research focuses on decision-making, teamwork, and leadership, and he has published 3 books, the latest of which will be the focus of today's episode, Unlocking Creativity. He also published Why Great Leaders Don't Take Yes for an Answer in its 2nd edition, and Know What You Don't Know. All are bestsellers, great books to have. Not only that, but he's developed 3 courses for the Great Course Lecture Series and his best-selling Everest Leadership Case Study. Welcome to the podcast, Mike.
Thanks, Charles. Good to be with you.
So today, the focus will be around design thinking. And I think this just has so many applications in the world of business. It's becoming more and more popular. People are looking at it in a different way, but there's some that even claim that design thinking has the potential to do what total quality management did for manufacturing by unleashing a person's full creative energies to win their commitment and radically improve processes. Would you agree with that statement, or is that a little bit of a reach?
I think there's a lot of promise, but I think that I worry when people inflate the expectations, right? These are all methodologies. They can help us, but they're not cure-alls, right? They can't fix everything in the business. But if you're looking to develop an innovative solution to a complex problem, it's a pretty darn solid creative problem-solving methodology that allows you to use certain tools and certain approaches that I think can get us out of our usual way of thinking and really help us to gain a better understanding of what our customer wants and needs.
Well, that's great. And I would advocate for that approach as well. I think there's a lot of excitement around it, but when you get into the details and thinking about it, it's an approach that can be effective if done the right way. And it's not an approach that's new necessarily, even though you have mentioned this in your programs as well. IDEO fashioned this concept and brought it more mainstream in the early 90s. However, Leonardo da Vinci and some of the others 400 or 500 years ago did the same or similar process with their inventions, with their process in which they were creative and designed various things. But I'd like to first go through kind of that history of it and why was that company, IDEO, so popular in revolutionizing or bringing it mainstream? What did they do differently that really reintroduced this concept?
You know, Dave Kelly, who founded IDEO, and his brother Tom and the group there, they were pretty remarkable in that they recognized something, which is that there was a toolkit, a set of techniques and methods that product designers used, right? And there were lots of people using these methods and techniques. And what they realized is, wait, we can codify that process, much of it in designers' heads, if you will, in terms of their approach. And we can apply it, right? This really is a problem-solving process. It's more than just about designing a physical product. We can tackle any complex problem using these techniques we learned as product designers, right? And so they started to codify what those techniques were and how that process unfolds and really structure it. And then, of course, there was this very famous episode of Nightline with Ted Koppel that happened in 1999, and they did something kind of unique. Instead of going and interviewing Dave Kelly, what they did is they created a fake project. And now a project at IDEO might take 3 months, for example, but this, they took 5 days. And they tried to invent a supermarket shopping cart for the 21st century. And they basically followed the team around at IDEO on this fake project, but they were really doing work, right, for 5 days, and boiled it all down to a half-hour episode of Nightline. And the thing went ballistic. Every educator like me on earth ordered the VHS tape. We used to laugh because we wore out the VHS tapes when I was at Harvard at the time. And we used to laugh and say, pick any topic, Charles, any topic you want to teach. We'll teach it with the 30-minute IDEO tape. Because you could teach teamwork, collaboration, decision-making, creativity, design thinking, like culture, like it was a powerful thing. And I think that started to open people's eyes to what are they doing out there? And then Dave Kelly did something, which also had a huge impact, which is he left IDEO to go back to Stanford, where he had gone to school and where he had been a faculty member. And he founded the Stanford Design School with others at Stanford. And that, of course, allowed them to start educating, lots of folks. And then did something which I'm so appreciative of, which is that they opened their materials to the world. IDEO and Stanford both said, here's the stuff. Here's our instructional material. Here it is. And so that's how this all got to the masses, I think. Lots of other design firms, of course, doing great work, but I think there was definitely a huge influence of IDEO there.
I would agree with you. And really everyone became intrigued by the notion that teams could apply this replicable framework, right, to solve many types of complex problems, not just in industrial design. And they thought then they had that roadmap that everyone could use and apply. And they didn't need to ensure that they hired these individuals with these special creative powers, right? It was replicable now with who they had in place if they identified the right process to put. But what you mentioned in your book, which I think is really relevant here too, is that a lot of companies tried this and initially they weren't successful at implementing this kind of design methodology throughout their organizations. Perhaps you can give us maybe one example, like with the Intuit case or one of those that really kind of goes into it and gives the leaders listening to this podcast just some ideas around, yes, it's something that has a lot of potential, but needs to be something that you're committed to in the long term and put forth in the right manner.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies, I mean, Intuit's had a lot of success with design thinking, but it's initially it was rocky there, as it was with a number of companies, and some of these companies gave up. Now, part of that is poor implementation or creating a little separate unit that was doing design thinking that got too isolated from the rest of the organization. But I think a lot of people blamed things like, well, our culture, you rejected it, or we didn't have the right people to execute it. Or like what I found is actually what ended up happening in a lot of companies is they applied the same sort of linear mindset to design thinking that they did to their typical sort of strategic planning process. Think about the way we do strategic planning. We do research, we do analysis, we develop projections, we build a plan, and we go out and execute the plan. It's a very linear process, and we go through it every 3 years or so, whatever it is in our company. Design thinking, if you look at the typical model, right, which is a 5-stage model that, for example, they teach at the Stanford D School and that I teach, it on the face of it, it looks linear. And so companies, I think, were thinking, if we just follow the steps, but it's not linear. Inherently, design thinking, there are two sort of core, in my mind, core ideas to design thinking. One is empathy, using a variety of interesting techniques for developing empathy for your user or your customer, okay, and for really understanding their needs and wants. But the second one, which is fundamentally nonlinear, is the idea of prototyping, experimenting, and iterating. People hear the expression fail often to succeed sooner. What that really means is it's not so much that we're trying to fail, but what it says is we're going to build to think, right? Instead of thinking first, then building, we're going to build to think. We're going to prototype, test, and experiment. And that's fundamentally nonlinear, because what that means is, Charles, you're going to try something, you're going to give it to the user. They're going to give you some feedback. You might have to go back and do more research, then come back and brainstorm again, then go try it again. And companies are like, whoa, this is not the way we operate, right? We operate with a perfect plan and a perfect process that we then go execute. And I think it goes against the DNA of a lot of companies,
No, that's so true, because that's the first mindset that they need to get away from in your book, is that linear mindset where it's sequential, right? And it looks like you said on the surface that it's the same linear process, but it's really not. And the linear models work well when the past can be used to predict the future, or when nothing has significantly changed. As everyone knows now, we're in a completely different new world where design thinking has even more potential to create innovative, creative solutions. And getting back to that first step of the 5-step model, and we'll just go through those briefly, maybe unpack a few of those, but it's really that getting the empathy, knowing how the consumer, the customer feels, right? So it starts with customer discovery, examining what it what it entails to have a meaningful customer journey, getting immersed in that. So traditional customer research has been impersonal. This really wants them to get inside the customer's mind, know about their preferences, reviews from focus groups, surveys, or even just a day in a life, right? So that you can better understand their needs. And that's so essential for that first part, right? Because if that part isn't done, then everything else that falls through the model, it's not going to be really meeting those needs or pain points of the customer.
You got it. And it's the hardest part. My colleague Allison Butler and I wrote an article where we basically make this argument: the design thinking is hard on the brain. And one of the hardest parts on the brain is actually the research with customers, because unlike traditional market research, design thinking does not rely primarily on surveys, large scale surveys. And the reason for that is that people say one thing and do another. It's sort of like when you go to the doctor and they ask, do you text and drive, or how many alcoholic drinks per week do you consume? I mean, who tells the truth? Like, no one, right? So the idea of design thinking is to go out in the field where customers are living, working, playing, eating, whatever it is, and observing them and interviewing them in their natural environment, where you can look and see, okay, is what they're telling me consistent with their behavior, right? And so it's this immersion that happens, which can be incredibly enlightening, but it's hard to do. And the reason it's so hard to do is that for many of us, when we go out to meet customers, we have pre-existing beliefs, and we are often searching for confirmation of what we already believe. And those blinders get in the way of seeing what's actually happening with these customers. And so this is why it's hard, right? It's really difficult to do, but you learn so much from getting out there where the customers are, not in a sterile lab, not in an office, but in their own environment. And then there's a whole lot of techniques we teach about how to get inside the mind and heart of the consumer to really understand their needs. But that's what empathy is all about. The hardest part. And if you don't do it right, the rest, I mean, the part that everyone gets excited about, we'll talk about later on, is the brainstorming, the Post-it notes everyone has seen. But that's not where the true genius is. It's actually in the hard work of going out and putting yourself in the customer's shoes.
And just to reiterate, that part about the biases and the blind spots that you have, that if you don't know those, if you don't account for those biases, the information that you're going to get is not going to be of the quality that you need. So it's so important to identify ways in which to filter that out so that you're not affected by it when you have that customer discovery process happening where you're collecting the data. Is there any tip that you can give our listeners regarding that to make them a little less biased and to filter out those in this discovery process?
Yeah. So one of the things we always recommend is that you don't go alone out in the field. You always have a partner with you, a partner in crime, because that you can check one another, right? It's a great way to make sure that you're doing that. We also encourage taking photos and video while you're out there. And then you can show the rest of your team and they can see the photos, see the video, and they might see things you didn't see. So that, documenting, not just in notes, but in visual, what you're seeing in the field, if you're allowed, if you're permitted, is also, so that partner and that visual evidence can help sort of protect against your own biases in many ways. I think the other thing is we explicitly ask people to record things that surprise them in the field. And by forcing them to write down a list of surprises, that's a way you're basically making them look for things that they didn't expect. It's not perfect, but those kind of tips can help.
Thanks for sharing those. Let's move to the next one. So now you've collected the data. Now you're trying to make sense of the data. So the emergent part of the experience provides that raw material for deeper insights, but finding patterns and making sense of this mass qualitative data could be a real daunting challenge. So time and time again, I've seen it personally, and I've talked to others where they just become overwhelmed by the volume of the information and the messiness of searching for deeper insights. So what is one way that they could sort through that and mine the data more effectively to look for these critical patterns?
So there's a number of techniques that, we teach. Perhaps the most famous and widely used is the idea of the journey map, right? So take all that data you learned about the customer and try to chart their journey. Maybe it's their journey to, how do they buy a new appliance for their home? And by journey, I mean, that begins not with walking into the store, right? That begins with, why did they decide they need an appliance for their home? How did they do research on that appliance? Maybe on the web, whatever. Where then did they go to procure that appliance, right? What was the steps and the interactions that occurred there? Then installation, delivery, installation, and after sale service, right? So it's a long journey, right? It's not just the transaction, right? And mapping that out, we have a whole methodology on how to do this. Lots of people do, right? You get incredible insights because one of the things you'll see in journey mapping is, and I like to do this. I love this technique is as you map out the journey, you map sort of the emotional journey of the customer using just emoticons. Are they happy? Are they sad? Right. And along the way,
Great idea. Right.
and you can see what we call the pain points, right? Oh, that's where Charles is really frustrated
Right.
because he doesn't understand, they're trying to upsell him and he can't tell the difference between the features on these refrigerators, right? I
Right.
mean, yeah, in TVs, they call it what they call the blue wall of death. All these
Right.
people are trying to tell you that you should pay $1,000 more and they all look the same, right? Like what's
Right.
going on? So the journey map is one. I mean, it's not the only one, but that's a really good way of sort of structuring your data.
And it identifies those pain points, right? Which is where you need to focus.
Pain points. The other thing we ask people to look for is workarounds. So a workaround is sort of a makeshift solution by the customer. The example is tennis balls on the bottom of a walker for an elderly person, right? That's a makeshift solution that we've all done. I'm doing it for my mom right now. I put tennis balls on the bottom of her walker. And workarounds are great because that's the customer screaming at you going, your product stinks. I had to fix it myself. Like, come on, what are you doing? Like, and I love those, right? Look for those. I tell people, look for those. That's the customer telling you, the Dunkin' Donuts iced coffee inside the styrofoam warm cup, terrible for the environment. But the poor customer's got this terrible iced coffee cup that's condensation everywhere, melting on a warm day. And so they solve the problem themselves because the cup is faulty.
And these are the two critical first stages. I mean, the step one and step two, and that many people don't realize that are critical, that are needed, perhaps the most important to get the process started in the right direction. Because now in the third step, this is the step that everyone associates with design thinking that they love and they like to just jump into without taking those necessary first two steps, right? And that's basically, it's in this stage three that design thinkers engage in idea generation using brainstorming and other techniques. And you mentioned in the book, it's kind of Linus Pauling's philosophy that the best way to have a good idea is to have lots of them. So there's lots of ways to create these brainstorming ideas. Maybe just kind of go over the critical nature of this stage and any tips with those brainstorming techniques.
So this is fun, right? It's always fun to generate ideas. As you say, if you haven't done the research, it's of no use. You have to do the research first. But then I think there's a couple of things. One is that, you have to really watch your group dynamics. One thing that gets in the way of brainstorming is social influence. Charles has a great idea and he dominates the group and suddenly out the window goes all the benefits of brainstorming. So you've got to really control.
A lot of biases could happen in this stage.
Oh boy. The other thing is, and this is, I think, something that has not gotten enough attention is, okay, so you've got 50 ideas up on the wall. And I think the mistake many people make is then they go, okay, we have to pick the best one. And going from 50 to one, not a good idea. Because now that becomes, either a deliberation, an argument, or someone in power makes the choice, or a mediocre compromise. So instead, what I suggest is sort of more of a winnowing process, right? And so we have a couple of techniques for winnowing it down, but not trying to go from 50 to one, but 50 to a smaller set. And then that takes us to the next stage, which is prototyping, where I argue, instead of you arguing in your own team, which is the best idea, you let the customer decide which of those 10, 12 ideas is the best idea. So I think the mistake people make is they think, oh, we brainstormed. Now we just have to pick which one's best. And that doesn't work. I mean, it requires a level of omniscience that just isn't there for most teams.
I would agree with you. I like that winnowing technique to reduce it gradually over time instead of just saying, here's the best one out of this huge set of possible solutions. So then we got
Charles, sorry, I advocate, and this is something I learned from the folks at Google, actually. I advocate keeping some sort of low-hanging fruit alive, meaning easy, quick win ideas. And then, of course, also keeping some ideas alive that are moonshots, right? So Like that's the other thing. It's not just about best idea. There are different kinds of ideas, right? There's the quick hitter win. There's the more strategic idea. I've learned some methodologies around how to do that, how to keep a few different kinds of ideas alive, because I think that's important. You don't only want low hanging fruit, but it's nice to have one or two because you get a nice win. It makes people feel good, right?
No, I would agree with you. And you want both categories. I mean, as you mentioned in some of the case studies and that you published, as well as in the benchmarking mindset, it's if you only look after the low hanging fruit, those that just have the incremental changes, you're not really looking at any disruptive changes. And you provide a great case study that you've done in the past about Planet Fitness, among many others, and Trader Joe's. And that's when you want the moonshots, right? That you want those that are going to be disruptive to the market, change the dynamics of it. But you also got to have the other ones, right? Because high risk, a lot of success associated if they pay off, but the other ones are more reliable, gives people confidence, gets that momentum built and that motivation to keep going with the process.
You got it. I mean, we need to deliver the continuous improvement the customer demands, but we don't want to let today get in the way of tomorrow, right? And so we need to also be thinking about tomorrow, right? What's the future and does it need to change more radically? But you got to make it better every day. The customer expects to, you to be working out the kinks every day and making your service, your product better. So you need both.
Right. And that's been an issue with many companies throughout the past. Many companies come to mind like Kodak, who was a dominant player in the market, and they were a dominant player in the digital market. They just, and they had enough time to react to it. They failed to do so. So that window of opportunity closed for them, even though they were one of the primary influencers initially in that market. And the list could go on and on with companies that don't see that, where it's just looking at incremental innovation instead of that disruptive innovation. That is where the technology and the market's going. So
Yep.
next step, prototyping. So now you got ideas, you've winnowed it down, 2 categories, maybe a couple ideas in each. This is really scary for a lot of people because now they feel like, okay, I want a product that I know people are going to like and we can move forward with. They have a lot of, okay, I've put a lot of time into this. Maybe it's a sunk cost trap, right? Or a time and effort, and it's a confirmation because it's kind of a personal affront on you if they don't like it. So you got to take your emotions out of it. You got to understand that this is an iterative process and you're just using it to get feedback in the prototyping stage, trying to get the minimum viable product out there, not the final product. It needs to be rough. It needs to be inexpensive and created quickly, right?
So yeah, we call it low fidelity prototyping, right? The reason to keep it simple, cheap, crude, rough isn't just because it saves you money and time. It's because, and this is the part that's key, and you mentioned this and you're talking about bias. It's because if you invest an enormous amount of time, effort, and money into the prototype, you will have a very hard time hearing negative feedback because you'll be over invested emotionally, right? In that. So by having it be something you don't put months and months into, you're also more receptive to the feedback, right? The other thing studies show, which is really important, is that you work on a couple of prototypes of a couple of different ideas. Don't work on one prototype at a time, but instead work in parallel. And because if you present your customer with 3 ideas, they're more likely to give you constructive advice because they can say, I like that one better than this one. If you give them one idea, you're essentially asking them to give you a thumbs up or thumb down. They, first of all, might be reticent to give you a thumbs down if they see you're all enthusiastic about the product, but also there's nothing to compare it to. So you protect yourself and you get better feedback if you keep a few ideas alive that way in parallel. And I think you stop yourself from maybe getting too emotionally invested in the one idea you think is awesome.
No, that's good advice. And let's talk about some of the issues around this stage. So, it turns out that most of us don't enjoy iterating frequently, nor are we particularly good at identifying why that's the case. And I would argue that we become invested in a particular solution quite easily, and we don't handle feedback very effectively. So we know that learning and adaptation will enhance the quality of our solutions, but we fall prey to that. We just love this idea, right? For whatever reason. And we're so quick to attach ourselves to this that it's hard to separate.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it is one of the biggest challenges, I think, when we're prototyping is that we try to perfect the prototype. First of all, we spend too long working on it because we try to insulate ourselves against negative feedback by creating the perfect prototype. So that's first mistake we make, right? Is spending too long trying to perfect it. And then, and this leads to the last stage, which is testing. When we go out to test, in other words, to put it in front of users and see what they think, we seek validation instead of seeking to learn. Eventually, you're going to have to validate, right? Once you get something that's much more refined. But in the early stages, you're looking to learn, not validate, right? And that's a challenge for all of us cognitively, I think.
No, that is so important. Just to reiterate, when you test, the final stage is testing the solutions, and you're doing it to learn, not to validate your concepts. And that mindset, that perspective shift is so critical to have the right perspective going into it, because even though a lot of people say they desire feedback, right? They don't really. They crave acceptance, praise, love, all those things that everyone should be craving, right? But they really don't want to hear it,
No, and I think there's two mistakes we make. We ask leading questions,
right?
right? And the other is that we start engaging in rebuttal with the customer. Oh, no, you don't understand. This is the way I intended for you to use it. Well, no, like they're using it the way they want to use it. Like your intentions don't matter, right? I mean, there's a famous story. I don't know if it's true or not. I think it's true, right? About Kleenex. When it was first launched in the market 100 years ago, Kleenex tissue, it was targeted, the goal of the tissue was supposed to be makeup removal for women. And their Neanderthal husbands started blowing their nose with it, right? And so Kleenex, to their credit, recognized, oh, instead of saying, no, don't do that, they realized there's a lot bigger market blowing your nose than there is in makeup removal. And holy cow, what those guys are doing is exactly what we should be catering to. But I think too often we put an idea in front of customers, and if they don't do what we thought they were going to do, we rebut them. We say, oh, no, and that's not what you want to do, right? You want to go, well, holy cow, wait a second. That's kind of interesting what they're doing.
Just open up a new opportunity, a new market, like Febreze, right? When it was first created as well.
I wrote a case years ago about Electronic Arts, the video game company. And they say, you almost by definition, when you're building a video game, you test it with users. You have to get good at just letting the user do what they want. That no video game user ever reads an instruction manual, right? So don't even bother writing one. That's not how they play video games, right? And so if they don't get it intuitively, what they're supposed to do, you can't correct them. You have to say, well, we didn't design it right because clearly it wasn't intuitive enough for them to figure out, because they're never going to read an instruction manual.
That's a great point to really drive that point home. So what happens if users then raise serious questions about the viability? So they haven't discovered a new use for it. They haven't opened up a market, but they really don't think it's viable or feasible. Many organizations, I find, right, they just plow ahead, sunk cost trap, right? They pour good money after bad money, and they just continue down that road that they're already committed to. But why do they do that? Is it something related to cognitive dissonance, like you say in your book, or are there other issues associated? And how can we get them out of that mindset?
Some of it is cognitive bias, that we're so invested, but there's an organizational element too, right? Which is that, there are certain organizational cultures where cutting your losses is just frowned upon. You're viewed as a failure if you abandon an idea. And so there is a cultural element, a leadership element. If you're leading a team, you have to make it okay for someone to say, okay, we got really negative feedback. We have to scrap this idea. So that social pressure in some organizational cultures is such that people look at it as career suicide to stop a project or to scrap an idea. So we have to fix that, because it isn't just an issue of personal bias, right? It is also an issue of the organization and the culture, the leadership we're in, that causes us to do that. I think the other thing is sometimes what we do is we try to tweak it, thinking I can tweak my way out of this, when in fact we have to confront the reality that there's probably no tweak in this. This idea just isn't resonating. I will say one thing about this, which is that sometimes you have to make sure that, you might be targeting the wrong customer. So you might be interviewing or testing with a customer and they don't really love the idea, but there might be a customer out there, a segment that this is correct for. So being clear on who you're trying to serve is a really important question. I think sometimes leads us astray, right? Go back to the original Netflix service, right? I think, very brilliantly, they understood that their target customer in the beginning was not the 40-year-old suburban mom driving the minivan. it was the 19-year-old male living in his mother's basement, right? I mean, so the service looked kind of crappy to the 40-year-old suburban mom. It didn't really serve her needs in the beginning. It looked awesome to the 19-year-old computer geek. Um, and eventually they improved it and modified it such that all of us parents of children who were in our 40s living in the suburbs found it attractive. But the initial Netflix service, if they had just scrapped it because 40-year-old moms didn't like it, that would have been a shame, right? There was a segment of consumers who it resonated with. And then the question became, okay, how do we broaden it? How do we adapt the service so that it's appealing more to those people who initially didn't really love it, right? I didn't sign up for it in 1999. That's
Right.
for sure. I was comfortable with Blockbuster.
No, that's so true, not only at a individual level, but an organizational level, is that you want to wait until you're good at something to go full into it instead of experimenting and iterating throughout that process to really learn what works and what doesn't. And in some cases, that's an essential piece of it. You're never going to have a pristine, polished, great looking product from the start. You're going to have to be satisfied with good enough. It's better to start down that path with a good enough than to wait for perfection that may never happen. And then you lose the opportunity in the market to really put that product out. Or as an individual, the career path, the opportunity might go away.
Yeah, and you've got to find safe ways to test, right? So if you're a retailer, you're not going to test something by putting it in all your stores. You're going to test it in a few stores, so it's safe and lower risk. Or, if you're testing on a new product, you might have a set of consumers who you work with who are willing to test things out privately without you putting it out on the market, because you don't want to tarnish your brand if you're a large company, right? So you do have to be careful about how you test, and that you don't damage your existing reputation by putting a shoddy product out there.
But I think another big issue with the design thinking process that many people have struggled with is their inability to learn from their mistakes through an iterative process. Getting back to feedback, right?
Yeah.
When most people examine other people's failures, they state, okay, it's because of them, something that happened. They don't have the expertise, they don't have the experience. But when we turn that on ourselves, we fail to look in the mirror. We attribute it to environmental factors. So we don't make the necessary changes we need to do to get better because we're not able to confront that in ourselves.
Yeah, psychologists call it the fundamental attribution error, right? When I fail, it's, when you fail, Charles, it's because you had a flaw inside of you. When I fail, it's because outside circumstances that I couldn't control, shape my behavior. So yes, this is really key to recognize that, if we put something out there, it doesn't work. We can't just jump to the conclusion that, well, the market conditions were unfavorable or the customer behavior was the problem here. No, we have to be willing to look in the mirror much harder, I think. Likewise, when other people, other companies succeed, don't let ourselves attribute it to just good fortune. We have to say, well, maybe they're doing some things better than we are. We have to learn from.
Are there any ways to separate that out or tips, tools, strategies that we can use to make sure that we're balancing it out so that we don't fall prey to this bias?
Well, I think, one of the things here is this is where it's really important to be able to have a great team that's working on this, right? And, I just think that, a lot of these challenges, a lot of the biases we run into can be counteracted by virtue of the people around us, right? That none of us is as smart as all of us, hopefully, right? If we get the right thinking going on there. I think the other thing, though, is you have to be able to call it out when you say, okay, we're blaming this on external factors. Let's park those over there for a sec. It might be that their shape, that's part of this, right? Look how many people have blamed COVID for all sorts of problems their products and services are having in the market. And maybe that's true, right? But maybe there's a whole lot of other factors that are causing your business to falter that don't have to do with the pandemic. So I think the ability to sort of park that and say, okay, now let's look and see, what else might be causing this besides that. So that kind of counterfactual is really important.
No, I would agree with that. So before we close today, I'd love to just go through an example, a challenge that you mentioned in your book, the Marshmallow Challenge, that really drives this point home of fixed linear thinking and versus design thinking and the effectiveness of two approaches. Now, the challenge is described as teams must construct a tall freestanding tower with 20 strands of spaghetti, a small amount of masking tape, a string, and a single marshmallow. And this experiment was performed with architects, engineers, business school graduates, and elementary age children, among other groups. But I want to focus kind of on those groups. particularly the business school graduates, the MBAs, and the children for you to kind of unpack each one of their approaches and why one was more effective than the other.
Right. So Tom Wojcik has a wonderful TED talk about this. He didn't create the Marshmallow Challenge. It was, I believe, created by Peter Stillman back when he was at IDEO. He's since long ago left. But Tom talks about running this with different kinds of people. And he shows some data that says that business school students and graduates underperform the elementary school kids by a significant margin. And the question is why? And well, he argues that the business school students are really linear thinkers, right? So they spend a lot of time trying to come up with the perfect architectural sketch of what their spaghetti tower is going to look like. And then they argue over what the right structure is. And now the time is ticking because this is a timed exercise. And finally, they start building, but now they're under a real time crunch. And very late in the game, they pick up the marshmallow and put it on top. And oh, by the way, they usually assume a marshmallow is light. And it turns out, that you have to have a pretty strong structure to hold the marshmallow, stronger than you think, right? It is light, but it's not that light, right? So on the other hand, what do the kids do, right? They naturally almost always pick up the marshmallow right away. They start playing with it. They start playing with the materials. They don't sit there and draw a perfect diagram, right? And so they are naturally
prototyping, they're testing.
Prototyping, right? You got it. And it's so powerful that they do that and they do better as a result.
That's a great way just to show that design thinking approach, how effective it can be, and the fixed or limited linear thinking mindset that most organizations fall into. Now, the last thing is really in your book, you go over 5 or 6 big mindsets that really, you identify 6 organizational mindsets that must be transformed for people to fulfill their creative potential. We've kind of talked about the linear mindset, just like to briefly go into one of the other ones, the benchmarking mindset.
Yeah.
Because many firms fall prey to this, where they study their competitors so closely that by doing so, they get fixed in that same process and they can't really adopt a new, novel, creative strategy, but they copycat. And you have a case study on this. You also put it in the book about what Planet Fitness did that caused them to break away from that mold.
Yeah, I'm not arguing against benchmarking, by the way. I think we have to, keep apprised of what our competitors are doing. But the natural tendency of a lot of firms is to imitate rather than innovate, right? They copy rather than saying, wait, what can we learn from our competitors, right? Or even more importantly, learn from people outside of our industry too, and then adapt it to what we're doing, right? As opposed to simply copying. And we're not intending to copy. It just kind of happens. There's some real powerful reasons why we get fixated on what we see at other firms and we copy. And I do use the Planet Fitness case. I had the opportunity to write a case and then get to know Mark Rundall over the last couple of years, who was the co-founder, who's an alumnus of the school at Bryant University where I teach. And, what Mark and his brother Michael did at Planet Fitness is said, and they, by the way, learned this by prototyping. They failed with their first gym. So they didn't get this like insight, like lightning. They got it from
realize that, right?
So what they did is, at first they built a gym like every other gym, catering to the fitness enthusiast. And they realized that's actually a really crummy business. It turns out it's a very hard business to make money in. The fitness enthusiasts are very demanding customers, yet they're also very fickle. Today they love, Soul Cycle. Tomorrow they love Orange Theory. They jump from method to method. There's all kinds of issues that make it a hard business to make money in. And we've seen a lot of bankruptcies. And what they went is, wait a second, what if we built a gym to the non-fitness enthusiast, to the person who's the couch potato, who hasn't belonged to the gym, who has an aspiration to be fit, but not, to be some marathon runner. They just would love to lose a few pounds or look better in that, suit or that dress. And if we could get them to get off the couch and come to the gym, well, what kind of a gym would we have to create to do that? And in many ways, it's the anti-gym, right? And so they poke fun at the bodybuilder with those great commercials, like I lift things up and put them down. And they created this place that if you go online in the blogs, the fitness enthusiasts tear it apart and decry it as like the end of the world. It's like the apocalypse that Planet Fitness is out there. Planet Fitness revels in that and says, it's okay. We're for the normal person, right? We're the judgment-free zone. So the great example of like, they learned from other gyms, but they didn't try to copy them.
And they used the design thinking process. They iterated, they experimented. Their first experiment in that space was a failure, but they learned and adapted and sought a novel solution, which is really what design thinking is all about. It's that human-centered approach to innovation, anchored in understanding the customer's needs, the rapid prototyping and generating the creative ideas that's going to hopefully transform the way you develop your product or service.
You got it. I mean, that's ultimately the idea, is that empathy and experimentation, right? Those two twin pillars of design thinking.
Well, thank you, Mike, for a great episode today. I always like to end each episode just with a call to action to our listeners. And if you could identify for them what maybe is one or two things they could do to get more design thinking focused, either in their approach individually as a team, or if they're high enough in their organization, looking at it more from an organizational level.
Get out of your office or out of your home office and get out into the world. I know we've been battling the pandemic, but there's only so much you can learn over Zoom. Get out there and see where your customers are and what they're doing. If we all did that, I think we'd learn a lot, and we'd get a lot of insight that we're not going to get just staring at a computer screen or sitting in our office. We have to get out there somehow.
Wonderful advice. Mike, remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you.
Sure. So ProfessorMichaelRoberto.com is my website, and that's probably the best way. They can reach me through there, and they can check out videos and other material that I put together, and learn more about some of the case studies that I've done in a variety of industries.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining me today, Mike. It's always a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully in an upcoming IMS program, as well as maybe in a future podcast.
Thanks, Charles. Great to be with you today.
This concludes this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. You can send us your feedback at info@ims-online.com. If you'd like to subscribe, this podcast can be found both on Apple and Spotify, and can also be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. And until next time, remember, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.